So many of these buildings that were built around the waterways were uh, very useful for the settlers at that time. You could find a foundry. Notice you could find a foundry. Once you found a foundry, it was found. So that's how they got the name foundry. Many times, the foundry was very important to the area because prior to foundries, which by the way are places where they convert raw minerals into metal. Now, prior to having metal, remember we already mentioned plastics. Prior to plastics, there were metals. Now, prior to metals, there were stones and sticks and stones. And there were also uh, flints, which was a kind of stone. But these tools that they used that were made from stones and made from sticks were not as durable, meaning they would not last, as well as the tools that were made from metals. So the foundry was the place that metals were made from raw materials. They would take a bunch of rocks, throw them into the foundry, and if they were lucky, they would find some metal. Well, no, that's not exactly how it worked. The foundry had to have a bellows that would go. A bellows was something that would talk very loudly, but it would also blow very hard. And so we got the name blowhard, because a blowhard was somebody who would talk very loudly and many times not know what he was talking about. But he would be bellowing nevertheless. And they used these bellows, these blowhards, to blow on a fire. Now, in order to make the bellow blow better, notice all the alliteration with the B's. The bellow would blow better if it was turned by a giant wheel. Now, the giant wheel was a water wheel. Hence, they would build the foundry by water. And as the water moved under the bellow wheel, the wheel would turn and it would blow on the fire. Now, the fire would melt all the rocks that they found around, and they'd cook them up really good. And it was kind of like where they got the word rock soup. But we won't get into that right now. And so they took these rocks and they made them into metal. Now, prior to that, say you were a hero in a war, they would give you a laurel wreath. Now, a laurel wreath was not really hard to make. You could make one. You could go out to your backyard, find a bunch of flowers, weave them, twist them up together, and make a little round wheel that you would then put on your head. And that was called a laurel wreath. And if you had a laurel wreath, that meant that you had done something really, really special. But once they had the foundry, you could take the foundry and you could make metals. And so they began to give metals to people. And that was the way they showed that they were really important heroes, by wearing a medal that the foundry had made. Once plastics came into effect, the foundries lost a lot of business. And so they have now become mostly lost in foundries, where they aren't really there anymore. They're lost and foundries. But sometimes you can find lost items in the lost and foundries that are still around. I have some pictures of where the original foundries were at Hibernia Park. Now, of course, it wasn't a park back then. Back then, it was just a woods and a creek. And occasionally, they'd build a house and a building. Well, besides the foundries that were frequently found on the waterways, they also had what was known as mills. Grist mills was one of the kinds of mills that they had. Now, grist mills were places that they would put things and just grind them up. Like they would grind them up into little pulverized pieces of little things. Like you could take a rock, for instance, and throw it in a grist mill and it would pulverize it until it became a pebble or something worse than that. Well, they would take corn kernels and throw that into the grist mill, and the mill would grind it up into powder, and you get corn flour. Now, corn flours are actually blue, and they grow on the edge of roads, but this was corn flour that you could make breads and tacos from. And so this was one of the things they could do. They could take wheat and grind that up, and they would make wheat flour. Now, I've never seen a wheat flour before, but apparently they're very beautiful and they're very useful. So anyway, this is where they would grind things up, and so it was called a grist mill. Even today, we have the use of the word grit. A child who has the ability to survive many beatings or many tough situations or many adverse circumstances is said to have grit. Now, that word grit originally came from the word grist. They used to be kids who had a lot of grist, but now they've changed it to kids who have a lot of grit. And so you can see how things evolve over time into more and more sensible ways of looking at what is around us. Now, I'd like to show you some pictures of Hibernia Park, because Hibernia Park is by far one of the nicer places. Now, remember, it was not a park back then. Let's see if I can get a picture or two into the video.